When the Great War broke out, it came to me not as a superlative tragedy, but as an interruption of the most exasperating kind to my personal plans. To explain the reason for this egotistical view of history's greatest disaster, it is necessary to go back, though only for a moment, as far as the decadent 90s, in which I opened my eyes upon the none too promising day. I have, indeed, the honor of sharing with Robert Graves the subject of my earliest recollection, which is that of watching, as a tiny child, the flags flying in the streets of Macclesfield for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Fortunately, there is no need to emulate my contemporaries' goodbye to all that in traveling still further back into the ponderous Victorianism of the 19th century, for no set of ancestors could have been less conspicuous or more robustly low-brow than mine. Although I was born in the mauve decade, the heyday of the Yellow Book and the Green Carnation, I would confidently bet that none of my relatives had ever heard of Max Beerbohm or Aubrey Beardsley, and if indeed the name of Oscar Wilde awakened any response in their minds, it was not admiration of his works, but disapproval of his morals. My father's family came from Staffordshire. The first place names bound up with my childish memories are those of the Five Towns and their surrounding villages: Stoke, Hanley, Burslem, Newcastle, Longport, Trentham, Barlaston, and Stone, and I still remember seeing, at a very early age, alarming glimpses through a train window of the pot-bank furnaces flaming angrily against a black winter sky. At an old house in Barlaston, then, as now, associated with the large and dominant Wedgwood family, my father and most of his 11 brothers and sisters were born. The records of my more distant predecessors are few, but they appear to have been composed of that mixture of local businessmen and country gentlemen of independent means, which is not uncommon in the Midland counties. They had lived in the neighborhood of the pottery towns for several generations, and estimated themselves somewhat highly in consequence, though there is no evidence that any of them did anything of more than local importance. The only ancestor of whom our scanty family documents record any achievement is a certain Richard Brittain, who was mayor of Newcastle under Lyme in 1741. The others were mostly small bankers, land agents, and manufacturers on a family scale. In 1855, when Victorian prosperity was flourishing on the pinnacle represented by the Great Exhibition of 1851, my great-grandfather gave up his work at a private bank in Newcastle and purchased a little paper mill in the Potteries from a Huguenot family of paper machine inventors. Towards the end of the century, his growing firm, in which my father was now a junior partner, acquired another small mill in the neighborhood of Leek. From this business, of which, in 1889, the weekly wages bill was under £12, the greater part of the family income has since been derived. My father was one of the 4 chief directors until his retirement during the war, and even I am a capitalist to the extent of owning a few shares. Out of my great-grandfather's experiment has now grown a large and flourishing concern, which produces some exquisite fine papers from the most up-to-date plant and machinery. Though the outlook of its directors honorable, efficient businessmen, like the shrewd North Country manufacturers in a Phyllis Bentley novel, is still tinged with the benevolent commercial feudalism of the later 19th century. The collective psychology of the neighborhood in my childhood may be deduced from a saying once proverbial in Staffordshire: "Let us go to Leek out of the noise." In those days, my father, who even now regards my membership of the Labour Party as a strange highbrow foible, used often to boast to chance visitors that his firm had never had a trade union man on the place. When my father, who was the best-looking and the most reasonable of a large and somewhat obstinate family, married my mother in 1891, his relatives disapproved, since she was without money or pedigree, and had nothing but her shy and wistful prettiness to recommend her. Instead of being the prospective heiress of county rank, which my prospering grandparents doubtless thought appropriate for their eldest son, She was merely the second of 4 daughters of a struggling musician who had come from Wales to take the post of organist at a church in Stoke-on-Trent. Since the remuneration brought in by this appointment was quite insufficient for the support of a wife and 6 growing children, he gave music and singing lessons, which paid a little, and composed songs and organ voluntaries, which did not pay at all. As a young man, my father fancied his voice, and so took a few singing lessons from the kindly organist. Thus he met my mother, then a graceful and exceptionally gentle girl of 21, dominated by her more positive mother and sisters. After they were married, rather quickly and quietly at Southport, owing to the sudden premature death of my charming but impecunious grandfather, my father's family showed no disposition, beyond a formal visit on the part of his mother to hers, to see any more of these modest in-laws, and for some years the 2 families continued to live within a few miles of each other, but hardly ever to meet. When I reached an age of comparative intelligence, I deduced from various anecdotes related by my young and pretty mother the existence of this attitude of initial disdain on the part of my father's people towards her own. For some years it puzzled me, since to my hypercritical youth, the majority of my paternal relatives, with their austere garments and their Staffordshire speech, appeared uncongenial and alarming, while my mother's sisters, all of whom made their way in the world long before independence was expected of middle-class women, were good-looking and agreeable, with charming musical voices and a pleasant taste in clothes. But after I left school, I soon learnt from my brief experience of the fashionable set in Buxton that a family's estimate of its intrinsic importance is not always associated with qualifications, which immediately convert the outsider to the same point of view. During the early years of their marriage, my parents lived at Newcastle-under-Lyme. They began their life together with a series of misfortunes, for their first child, a boy, was stillborn, and shortly afterwards my father developed appendicitis, which proved a baffling mystery to the rough and ready provincial surgeons of the time, and left him prostrate for nearly 12 months. Eventually, however, I made my appearance at the decorous little villa in Sidmouth Road, arriving precipitately but safely during my father's absence at a pantomime in Hanley. In the early stages of that urge towards metropolitanism, which I developed with adolescence, I used to believe that such a typically provincial suburb as Newcastle could never have produced any man or woman of the smallest eminence, and with the youthful confidence that characteristically prefers to dwell on the fruits of success rather than to calculate their cost. I made up my mind as quickly as possible to repair that omission. But a few years ago, I strangely discovered, through a chance meeting in a wagon lit on the way to Geneva, that the small Staffordshire town, or rather, an adjacent village known as Silverdale, was at least the birthplace of Sir Joseph Cook, a former High Commissioner for Australia who during our brief acquaintance at the League that summer habitually addressed me as Little Newcastles. I must have been about 18 months old when my family moved to Macclesfield, which was a reasonable, though none too convenient railway journey from the Potteries. Here, in the small garden and field belonging to our house, and in the smooth, pretty Cheshire lanes with their kindly hedges and benign wildflowers, I and my brother Edward, less than 2 years my junior, passed through a childhood which was to all appearances as serene and uneventful as any childhood could be. The first memories of my generation are inevitably of an experience which we all share in common, for they belong to dramatic national events, to the songs, the battles, and the sudden terminations of suspense in a struggle more distant and more restricted than that which was destined to engulf us. Like the rest of my contemporaries, I began to distinguish real occurrences from fables and fancies about the time that the South African War broke out at the end of 1899. Before 19, though animate and assertive, I could hardly have been described as a conscious observer of my background. From the unrolling mists of oblivious babyhood, the strains drift back to me of "We're Soldiers of the Queen," "Me Lads," And goodbye, Dolly. I must leave you." An organ was triumphantly playing the first of these tunes in a Macclesfield street, one cold spring morning, when I noticed that banners and gay streamers were hanging from all the windows. "It's because of the relief of Ladysmith," my mother explained, in response to my excited questioning. "Now Uncle Frank will be coming home." But Uncle Frank, a younger brother of my father's, who had been farming in South Africa when the war began and had joined the Queen's forces as a trooper, never came home after all. For he died of enteric in Ladysmith half an hour before the relief of the town. I had quite forgotten him on a grey January afternoon, nearly a year later, when I sat snugly in our warm kitchen, drawing birds and dragons and princesses with very long hair, while the old lady whose diamond jubilee had made such an impression upon my 3-year-old consciousness sank solemnly into her grave. In front of the fire, the little plump cook read the evening paper aloud to the housemaid. "The Queen is now asleep," she quoted in sepulchral tones, while I, absorbed with my crayons, remained busily unaware that so much more than a reign was ending, and that the long age of effulgent prosperity into which I had been born was to break up in 13 years' time with an explosion which would reverberate through my personal life to the end of my days. It seemed only a few weeks afterwards, though it was actually 18 months. And peace with South Africa had already been signed, that Edward and I were assiduously decorating with flags the railing which divided the lower lawn from the hayfield, when my father came hurriedly up the drive with an anxious face and a newspaper in his hand. "You can take down your decorations," he announced gloomily. "There will be no coronation. The king's ill." That night I prayed earnestly to God to make the dear king better and let him live. The fact that he actually did recover established in me a touching faith in the efficacy of prayer, which superstitiously survived until the Great War proved to me, once for all, that there was nothing in it. To those who were 20 or more at the time of Victoria's death, the brief reign of Edward, to whatever extent that indefatigable visitor to Paris and Biarritz may have been a factor in the coming of the deluge, when it did, must have seemed merely a breathing space between the Victorian age and the German invasion of Belgium. To us, the war generation, it was much more than that. For in those 9 years we grew from children into adolescents or adults. Yet of the king himself I remember nothing between his untimely attack of appendicitis and the pious elegy in the best Victorian manner which I produced at school when my form was told to write a poem in memory of his passing. Not only in its name, Glen Bank, and its white-painted semi-detachment, but in its hunting pictures and Marcus stone engravings, its plush curtains, its mahogany furniture, and its scarcity of books, our Macclesfield house represented all that was essentially middle class in that Edwardian decade. Following the long-established example of my father's parents, we even had prayers before breakfast, during which performance everybody from my mother, who perturbedly watched the boiling coffee machine on the table, to the maids who shuffled uneasily in their chairs, while the postman banged at the front door and the milkman thundered at the back, presented an aspect of inattentive agitation. The ceremony frequently ended in a tempestuous explosion on the part of my father, since Edward was almost always late, and could never say the Lord's Prayer as rapidly as the others. As a rule, he was still patiently pleading with the deity to lead him not into temptation, while the rest of us were thankfully vociferating amends. Although my father, as a self-willed young man in his 30s, was somewhat liable to these outbursts of irritation, they never really alarmed me, for he was always my champion in childhood, and could be relied upon as a safe bulwark against the bewildering onslaughts of his practical joke-loving younger brothers and sisters, who regarded a small girl as fair game for their riotous ingenuity. Far more disturbing to my peace of mind was the strange medley of irrational fears, which were always waiting to torment me: fears of thunder, of sunsets, of the full moon, of the dark, of standing under railway arches, or crossing bridges over noisy streams, of the end of the world and of the devil, waiting to catch me around the corner. This last being due to a nursemaid who overheard me, at the age of 5 or 6, calling Edward little fool, and immediately commented, "There, you've done it. Now you'll go to hell." Parents and nurses had by that time outgrown the stage of putting children into dark cupboards as a cure for this type of tiresomeness, an atrocity once perpetrated on my mother, which adversely affected her psychology forever afterwards. But such terrors did appear to them to have no other origin than a perverse unreasonableness, and I was expostulated with and even scolded for thus giving ways. There seemed to be no one to whom I could appeal for understanding of such humiliating cowardice, nobody whom I instinctively felt to be on my side against the mysterious phenomena which so alarmed me. Since I thus grew up without having my fears rationalized by explanation, I carried them with me, thrust inward, but very little transformed, into adulthood, and was later to have only too good reason to regret that I never learnt to conquer them while still a child. On the whole, in spite of these intermittent terrors, the years in which life is taken for granted were pleasant enough, if not conspicuously reassuring. For as long as I could remember, our house had always been full of music, never first-rate, but tuneful, and strangely persistent in its ability to survive more significant recollections. To the perturbation of my father, who never really cared for music in spite of the early singing lessons, there was always much practicing of songs, or pianoforte solos, and later of violin exercises. And in Macclesfield my mother gave periodic musical evenings for which Edward and I, at the ages of about 7 and 9, used to sit up in order to play tinkling duets together, or innocuous trios with our governess. My mother, who had an agreeable soprano voice, took singing lessons in Manchester. At musical parties, she sang "When the Heart is Young," "Whisper, and I Shall Hear," or "The Distant Shore," a typical example of Victorian pathos, which always reduced me to tears at the point where the maiden drooped, died. I was much more stimulated by Robert the Devil, and whenever my mother, her back safely turned towards me, trilled "Mercy" in her ardent soprano, I flung myself up and down upon the hearthrug in an ecstasy of masochistic fervor. My first acquaintance with literature was less inspiring, for in Macclesfield the parental library consisted solely of a few yellow-back novels, 2 or 3 manuals on paper-making, and a large tome entitled Household Medicine, in which the instructions were moral rather than hygienic. Lest anyone should suspect the family of being literary, these volumes were concealed beneath a heavy curtain in the chill, gloomy dining room. My father was once told by a publisher's traveler that the Pottery Towns held the lowest record for book buying in England. Being a true son of his district, which has an immense respect for brass, but none whatever for the uncommercial products of a poetic imagination, he remained faithful in Cheshire as in Staffordshire to his neighborhood's reputation. When I had exhausted my own nursery literature, a few volumes of Andrew Lang's fairy tales, one of which was punctiliously presented to me on each birthday, and some of the more saccharine children's stories of L.T. Mead, I turned surreptitiously to the yellow-back novels. These were mostly by Wilkie Collins, Besant and Rice, and Mrs. Henry Wood, and many were the maudlin tears that I wept over the sorrows of poor Miss Finch and Lady Isabel Vane. It was not till later, at the age of 10, that I discovered the manifold attractions of household medicine. The treatment of infectious diseases left me cold, but I was secretly excited at the prospect of menstruation. I also found the details of a confinement quite enthralling, though I had never shown that devotion to dolls which is supposed to indicate a strong maternal instinct. The whole subject of childbirth was completely dissociated in my mind from that of sex, about which I knew little and cared less. I was particularly impressed at the time by the instructions given to the childbearing woman in the final stage of labor. though I can now only remember that she was advised to braid her hair in 2 plaits, and to wear an old flannel petticoat under her nightgown. I must have been about 8 when 2 solitary classics, probably neglected Christmas presents, found their way onto a whist table in the drawing room. One was Longfellow's complete poems, bound in a bilious mustard-brown leather, and the other a copy of Matthew Arnold's Sohrab and Rustum. I soon had Longfellow's poems, including Tales of a Wayside Inn and the New England Tragedies, almost by heart, and even now, when I am searching through my memory for an appropriate quotation, "Life is real, life is earnest, and hadst thou stayed, I must have fled," will insist upon ousting Houseman and Siegfried Sassoon. But I found Sohrab and Rustum even more entrancing than Longfellow, and over again, when I was sure of having the drawing room to myself, I indulged the histrionic instinct which had derived so much satisfaction from Robert the Devil by imitating in dumb show the throes of the unfortunate Sohrab, lovely in death, upon the common sand. My mother did her conscientious best to remedy the deficiencies of our literary education by reading Dickens aloud to us on Sunday afternoons. We plowed through David Copperfield and Nicholas Nickleby in this manner, which perhaps explains why I have never been able to finish anything else by Dickens except A Tale of Two Cities. Far more effective as compensations for the lack of external stimulus were the 5 novels that I wrote before I was 11, on special books patiently constructed for me by a devoted and intelligent governess out of thick waste paper from the mills, and the exciting legends of a mythical community called the Dicks, which from my bed in the night nursery I used to relate to Edward across the passage in the day nursery, after we were both supposed to be asleep. I was always the inventor, and he the recipient of these enthralling communications, which must have begun when I was about 6, and continued until I reached the mature age of 11 and went to school. Edward was always a good listener, since his own form of self-expression then consisted in making unearthly, and to me, quite meaningless sounds on his small violin. I remember him, at the age of 7, as a rather solemn, brown-eyed little boy, with beautiful arched eyebrows, which lately, to my infinite satisfaction, have begun to reproduce themselves, a pair of delicate question marks, above the dark eyes of my 5-year-old son. Even in childhood, we seldom quarreled, and by the time that we both went away to boarding school, he had already become the dearest companion of those brief years of unshadowed adolescence permitted to our condemned generation. When I was 11, our adored governess departed, and my family moved from Macclesfield to a tall gray stone house in Buxton, the Derbyshire mountain spa, in order that Edward and I might be sent to good day schools. His was a small preparatory school, of which a vigorous Buxton man was then headmaster. Mine inevitably described itself as a school for the daughters of gentlemen. My brother's school, which certainly gave him a better grounding than I received from mine, will always be associated in my recollection with one significant experience. Soon after Edward went there, I happened, on my way to the town, to pass the school playground at a time when the boys were uproariously enjoying an afternoon break. Seeing Edward, I stopped. He called several of his newly made cronies, and we spent a few moments of pleasant ragging across the low wall. I felt no consciousness of guilt, and was unaware that I had been seen, on their return home along an adjacent road, by my mother and an aunt who was staying with us. At tea time, a heavy and to me inexplicable atmosphere of disapproval hung over the table. Shortly afterwards, the storm exploded, and I was severely reprimanded for my naughtiness in thus publicly conversing with Edward's companions. I think it was the same aunt who afterwards informed me that the reason why our letters had to be left open at my school was in case any of the girls should be so wicked as to write to boys. Probably this was true of most girls' schools before the war. The small incident was my first intimation that, In the eyes of the older generation, free and unself-conscious association between boys and girls was more improper than a prudish suspicion of the opposite sex. It aroused in me a rebellious resentment that I have never forgotten. I had not heard, in those days, of coeducational schools, but had I been aware of their experimental existence and been able to foresee my far-distant parenthood, I should probably have decided, then and there, that my own son and daughter should attend them. I do not remember much about my day school, except that when I first went there, I was badly bullied by two unpleasant little girls, who soon tired of the easy physical advantage given them by their superior age and stature, and instead endeavored to torment my immature mind by forcing upon it items of sexual information in their most revolting form. My parents, who had suffered such qualms of apprehension over my entirely wholesome friendliness with Edward's riotous companions, remained completely unaware of this real threat to my decency and my peace. I never mentioned it to them owing to a bitter sense of shame, which was not, however, aroused by my schoolfellows' unesthetic communications, but by my inability to restrain my tears during their physical assaults. So ambitious was I already, and so indifferent to sex in all its manifestations, that their attempts to corrupt my mind left it as innocent as they found it, and I resented only the pinchings and wrist twistings which always accompanied my efforts to escape. Though my school took a few boarders, most of its pupils were local. In consequence, the classroom competition was practically non-existent. At the age of 12, I was already preening the gay feathers of my youthful conceit in one of the top forms, where the dull, coltish girls of 16 and 17 so persistently treated me as a prodigy that I soon lost such small ability as I had possessed to estimate my modest achievements at their true and limited worth. When I first went to the school, it was in charge of an ancient mistress who was typical of the genteel and uncertificated past. But soon afterwards, a new principal was appointed with an unimpeachable degree acquired from Cheltenham. In Buxton, this was regarded as quite a remarkable qualification for a headmistress, and in those days, my parents' standards of scholarship were almost as unexacting. They had never, indeed, had much opportunity to become otherwise, for my mother had received a very spasmodic and unorthodox education, while my father, after reacting with characteristic if pardonable obstinacy against the rigors of Malvern in the 1870s, had been sent to the high school at Newcastle under Lyme, where the boys' only consistent occupation was a perpetual baiting of the much-enduring masters. During my father's uproarious days at Newcastle High School, a Hanley boy, 2 or 3 years his junior, named Enoch Arnold Bennett, was more profitably pursuing his studies at the middle school in the same town. There was, needless to say, very little communication between the pupils from the middle school and the domineering young tyrants at the high school. Even after the author of The Old Wives' Tale had won his lasting place in English literature, my relatives still thought nothing much of the Bennets, whom they characteristically described as very ordinary peoples. The education given to my parents, in both quality and quantity, was of a type at that time shared, and considered quite adequate, by almost the whole of the provincial middle classes. Its shortcomings were in no way compensated by the superior attainments of their friends, for throughout my childhood in Macclesfield and Buxton, I cannot remember that anyone ever came to the house of more interest to me than relatives, or mentally restricted local residents with their even more limited wives. These families were typical of the kind that still inhabit small country towns. The wives kept houses, and the husbands occupied themselves as branch bank managers, cautious and unenterprising solicitors, modest businessmen who preferred safety to experiment, and family doctors whose bedside manner camouflaged their diagnostical uncertainties. Schoolmasters were not encouraged, as my father found their conversation tedious. Always a staunch free trader, he was ready to join issue against any supporter of Joseph Chamberlain in the topical controversy of free trade versus tariff reform. but he did object to being diverted from the enthralling discussion of paper manufacture to subjects of such remote interest as the bombardment of Port Arthur, the Turkish atrocities in Macedonia, or the policy of the Russian Revolutionary Party, which was bloodily agitating for the establishment of a Duma. To my own immature ears, hardly an echo of these or other far-off, and rather more divine events ever succeeded in penetrating. Even the elements of fiscal argument, though respectable enough, were regarded as beyond a schoolgirl's understanding. I suppose it was the very completeness with which all doors and windows to the more adventurous and colorful world, the world of literature, of scholarship, of art, of politics, of travel, were closed to me, that kept my childhood so relatively contented a time. Once I went away to school and learnt, even though from a distance that filled me with dismay, what far countries of loveliness and learning and discovery and social relationship based upon enduring values lay beyond those solid provincial walls which enclosed the stuffiness of complacent bourgeoisdom so securely within themselves. My discontent kindled until I determined somehow to break through them to the paradise of sweetness and light, which I firmly believed awaited me in the South. I often wonder how many of my present-day friends were themselves limited by a horizon as circumscribed as that which bounded my first 13 years. Up to the time, indeed, that I was 21, my sole contacts with life outside England were confined to a cook's tour to Lucerne, where I developed mumps immediately on arrival, and spent the rest of the fortnight in a sanatorium, and a brief visit to Paris, during which my father was knocked down by a taxicab and promptly insisted upon all of us returning to Buxton. I believe that it is Albert Edward Wigham, the American author of The Fruit of the Family Tree, who has calculated that half the world's distinguished men and women are produced by only 1% of its population, and that all the teeming mediocre millions of the rest of mankind are required to contribute the other half of its leaders. But when I consider, and in my later teens I often used to consider, the incalculable advantages of heredity and early environment that are involved in merely being born a member of such families as the Huxleys, the Haldanes, the Frys, the Darwins, or the Arnolds, what really seems remarkable is not that the undistinguished residue produces only half the sum of human talent, but that those who belong to it ever emerge at all from the blackest obscurity. At the age of 13, small for my years and still very much of a child in spite of my mature fifth form associates, I was sent away to school at the recently founded Est Monica's at Kingswood in Surrey. A safe choice because the eldest and ablest of my mother's sisters was one of the two princessals. Her partner, Louise Heath Jones, a brilliant, dynamic woman who had been educated at Cheltenham and Newnham, alternately inspired and intimidated both girls and mistresses by her religious idealism and the strongly individual quality of her teaching. The tempo at which her ardent spirit caused her to live wore out too quickly her fragile constitution. A premature breakdown led to her early retirement soon after I left the school, and she died in 1931 after many years of illness. My aunt, level-headed and self-reliant, remained in charge from 1914 until the end of 1930, and though she possessed neither college degree nor technical training in education, her personal dignity and her natural gift for organization soon raised Stonica's to a high position with a refreshingly enlightened and broad-minded regime among girls' private schools. It has recently passed out of this category into the hands of an exclusively masculine committee, and now ranks as a public school. When, a few years before the war, I first went to St. Monica's, the young school had not yet reached the high educational standards of its later days, and though my budding ambition to go to college, which developed as soon as I discovered that such places as women's colleges existed, and learnt what they stood for, met with real sympathy from both principals and staff, it received no practical preparation for the necessary examinations, which were not then taken as a matter of normal routine. No doubt my father's persistent determination throughout my school days that I should be turned into an entirely ornamental young lady deterred both my aunt and Miss Heath Jones from the efforts that they would otherwise have made on my behalf. The most benevolent and aspiring headmistresses are, after all, singularly helpless in the hands of misguided but resolute parents. My classroom contemporaries regarded my ambitions, not unnaturally, with no particular interest or sympathy. Many of them were fashionable young women to whom universities represented a quite unnecessary prolongation of useless and distasteful studies, and they looked upon my efforts to reach the top of a form, and my naive anxiety to remain there, as satisfactorily exonerating them from the troublesome endeavor to win that position for themselves. Socially, of course, I was quite without standing among these wealthy girls, designed by their parents for London or Edinburgh society, with their town addresses in Mayfair or Belgravia, and their country houses of which the name hall or park was frequently a part. My parents could not afford the numerous theaters and concerts to which many of them were taken by request of their families. My best clothes were homemade or purchased from undistinguished shops in Buxton or Manchester, and the presents that I received at Christmas or on birthdays did not bear comparison with the many elegant gifts that my classmates displayed for the admiration of contemporaries on returning to school after the holidays. It is hardly surprising that few of the girls coveted the reputation unenthusiastically conceded to me for brains, or even envied my comparative freedom from refused lessons, but regarded these assets as mere second-rate compensations for my obvious inferiority in the advantages that they valued most. In those days, as in these, girls' private schools attracted but few parents possessed of more than a half-hearted intention to train their daughters for exacting careers, or even for useful occupations. Both for the young women and their mothers, the potential occurrence that loomed largest upon the horizon was marriage. And in spite of the undaunted persistence with which both the principals upheld their own progressive ideals of public service, almost every girl left school with only two ambitions: to return at the first possible moment to impress her schoolfellows with the glory of a grown-up toilette, and to get engaged before everybody else. Although I was then more deeply concerned about universities than engagements, I shared the general hankering after an adult wardrobe, which would be at least partly self-chosen, since all girls' clothing of the period appeared to be designed by their elders on the assumption that decency consisted in leaving exposed to the sun and air no part of the human body that could possibly be covered with flannel. In these later days, when I lie lazily sunning myself in a mere gesture of a bathing suit on the gay plage of some small Riviera town, or even, during a clement summer, on the ultra-respectable shores of southern England, and watch the lean brown bodies of girl children, almost naked and completely unashamed, leaping in and out of the water, I am seized with an angry resentment against the conventions of 20 years ago, which wrapped up my comely adolescent body in woolen combinations, black cashmere stockings, Liberty bodice, dark stockinette knickers, flannel petticoat, and often, in addition, a long-sleeved, high-necked, knitted woolen spencers. At school, on the top of this conglomeration of drapery, we wore green flannel blouses in the winter and white flannel blouses in the summer, with long navy blue skirts, linked to the blouses by elastic belts, which continually slipped up or down, leaving exposed an unsightly hiatus of blouse tape, or safety-pinned shirt-band. Green and white blouses alike had long sleeves ending in buttoned cuffs at the wrist, and high collars covering the neck, almost to the chin, and fastening tightly at the throat with stiff green ties. For cricket and tennis matches, even in the baking summer of 1911, we still wore the flowing skirts and high-necked blouses with our heavy hair braided into pigtails. It was not until after the war that the school went into sleeveless white linens for summer games. Only in the gymnasium class did our handicapped limbs acquire freedom, and even then, the tight, Long-sleeved blouses were worn under our weighty, pleated tunics. In spite of these impediments, the games and drill did make us lithe and hard. And during the war, I had reason to thank them for the powers of endurance of which they laid the foundation. The only intimate friends that I made at Kingswood were a small, dark, half-foreign girl and a pretty, fair, sweet-natured Anglo-Saxon, whose names might very suitably have been Mina and Betty. Mina, a younger daughter in a large and wealthy family, displayed at school a real artistic talent, while Betty possessed intellectual possibilities, which she was never sufficiently interested to explore, owing to a quite frankly acknowledged desire to marry and have children. In neither case did the intimacy long survive our departure from school. Mina, during the war, developed under the stress of a perturbing love affair, a strong disapproval of my character, which led her to conclude that I had never been worthy of her friendship. When I was nursing in London in the early part of 1916, and she was cultivating her considerable gift for drawing at an art school, she made an appointment with me at, of all appropriate places for a moral condemnation, the Albert Memorial, in order to inform me that I was selfish, insincere, ambitious, and therefore no longer deserving of her affection. I can see her sturdy little figure now, conspicuous in a coat and skirt of strange pink cloth against the solid stone basis of the immaculate Albert, as she arraigned me for the harsh, unmelting bitterness into which I had been frozen by the first real tragedy of my experience. You never really cared for Roland. You only wanted to marry him out of ambition. If you'd really loved him, you couldn't possibly have behaved in the way you've done the past few weeks. It was, of course, typical of the average well-to-do girl of the period to assume that the desire for power, which is as universal among women as among men, could only be fulfilled by the acquisition of a brilliant husband. I do not recall the mood in which I spent the long bus ride back to Camberwell, but I probably minded dreadfully at the time. At any rate, we parted for good, and I cannot recollect that I have ever encountered Mina since that morning. With Betty, the association lasted longer, and I owe far more to it. For nearly 2 years during the war, we served by arrangement in the same military hospitals, and even after it was over, kept up the kind of friendship that renews itself at Old Girls' Association meetings and exchanges of annual Christmas cards. But real intimacy between us became difficult as soon as we left school, for our homes were in different parts of England. Our parents cherished different social aspirations, and our personal ambitions were not the same. Betty had no desire for a university education or the independence of a professional woman. The war, which frustrated individual as well as national hopes, caused her future to remain uncertain until 1922, when she married a man considerably her senior, who soon afterwards became a Conservative member of Parliament. Today, her 2 pretty children, a little older than my own, still provide a point of contact between lives, which in other respects could hardly differ more widely. I remember Kingswood very clearly as it looked 20 years ago, with the inviolate downs stretching away to Smitham, and the thick woods unbroken by the pink and grey eruption of suburban villas, which has now torn them ruthlessly into sections. On summer evenings, one of our favorite rambles took us across the sloping fields, sweet with clover and thyme and wild roses, between Kingswood and Chipstead. There, as twilight descended, we looked a little nervously at the darkening sky for indications of Halley's comet, which was said to herald such prodigious disasters, or listened more serenely to the nightingales in a stillness broken only at long intervals by the lazy, infrequent little trains which ambled down the toy railway line in the valley. The thyme and the roses still blossom bravely about those doomed meadows, but I have never heard the nightingales there since the war, and the once uninterrupted walks have long been spoilt by barbed wire barriers and notices drawn up for the intimidation of stray trespassers. In the months before I went up to Oxford, when I had to plough, solitary and unaided, through the tedious intricacies of examination syllabuses. I often privately condemned my parents for not sending me to Cheltenham, or Rogen, or even to an ordinary high school, where practiced authorities would have saved me from the fret of wrestling with academic mysteries. But of late years, I have realized that St. Monica's, although it did not then possess certain routine advantages of a public school, is very far from being a matter for regret. No doubt it did not provide that prolonged and exacting type of education which is now the inevitable preliminary to any professional career, but such training was then mainly obtainable in schools, which sterilized the sexual charm out of their pupils and turned them into hockey-playing hoydens, with gauche manners and an armory of inhibitions. St. Monica's did not, of course, prepare me either for the strain and stress of a very few years later, but I question if the artificial atmosphere of hockey matches and high school examinations would have done this any better, or whether indeed the early development of a more critical and less idealistic spirit would have proved, in the long run, an effective weapon against annihilating calamity. A dozen years' periodic observation of Oxford dons has led me to doubt whether, even for those misguided dupes, the boys and girls of the war generation, an overdevelopment of the critical faculty would not have been at least as dangerous as its underdevelopment. The latter, at any rate, does nothing to destroy that vitality, which is more important than any other quality in combating the obstacles, the setbacks, and the obtuse ridicule, which are more often encountered in early youth than at any other time. We were too young to have had power to divert the remorseless impetus of history. We should probably have gone to the war, whatever our psychology, and it is arguable that our early months of illumined faith were a factor in the ultimate return of some of us to life. At least the unexacting demands of the easy lessons at St. Monica's, the mildness of the intellectual competition, a little more substantial than that of the Buxton School only because the girls were drawn from a wider area, and the lovely peace of the rich, undisturbed country, left scope for much reading of Dante and Shakespeare, of Shelley and Browning and Swinburne, and gave opportunity for dreams of which many, in the strangest ways and against all probability, have since materialized. Only the other day a fellow journalist, half rueful and half amused, told me that I had made a better thing out of sex equality than she had ever thought possible, for such a portentous topic, until I began to scatter articles on equal pay and married women's careers through the pages of the daily and weekly press. If that is so, I can only reply that I have written nothing on the various aspects of feminism which has not been based upon genuine conviction, and that the foundations of that conviction were first laid, strangely enough, at a school which was apparently regarded by many of the parents who patronized it as a means of equipping girls to be men's decorative and contented inferiors. Miss Heath Jones, who from my knowledge of her temperament, I now suspect to have been secretly in sympathy with the militant suffrage raids and demonstrations, which began after the foundation of the Women's Social and Political Union in 1905, was an ardent, though always discreet feminist. She often spoke to me of Dorothea Beale and Emily Davies, lent me books on the woman's movement, and even took me with one or two of the other senior girls in 1911 to what must have been a very mild and constitutional suffrage meeting in Tadworth Village. This practical introduction to feminism was to be forever afterwards associated in my mind with the great heat. The railway strikes, the Parliament Bill debates, and the international crises of that hectic summer, which provided such wealth of topical detail for my passionate editorial in the 1911 school magazine. To this day, I can remember some of the lessons which Miss Heath Jones gave us in history and scripture. Lessons which raced backwards and forwards in the same 5 minutes from the French Revolution to the Liberal victory in the 1910 general elections, from the prophecies of Isaiah to the 1911 Italian invasion of Tripoli. From the unimaginative standpoint of pre-war examinations, they were quite unpractical, but as teaching in the real sense of the word, the creation in immature minds of the power to think, to visualize, to perceive analogies, they could hardly have been surpassed. In 1908, after Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, she set us drawing maps of the Balkan Peninsula, and in 1911, she arranged a school debate on the Morocco crisis, about which I held forth with vague but patriotic fervor, when Germany sent the panther to Adird. Her encouragement even prevailed upon us to read the newspapers, which were then quite unusual adjuncts to teaching in girls' private schools. We were never, of course, allowed to have the papers themselves. Our innocent eyes might have strayed from foreign affairs to the evidence being taken by the Royal Commission on Marriage and Divorce, or the report of the International Paris Conference for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, and the carefully selected cuttings invariably came from the Times or the Observer, unmodified by contrary political opinions. But the fact that we had them at all testified to a recognition of the importance of current events far from customary, at a time when politics and economics were still thought by most headmistresses to be no part of the education of marriageable young females. Among the girls, Miss Heath-Jones's lessons were not always appreciated, for most of the sheltered young women in that era displayed no particular anxiety to have the capacity for thought developed within them. Even now I recall the struggles of some of my contemporaries to avoid facing some of the less agreeable lessons of 1914. There is still, I think, not enough recognition by teachers of the fact that the desire to think, which is fundamentally a moral problem, must be induced before the power is developed. Most people, whether men or women, wish above all else to be comfortable, and thought is a preeminently uncomfortable process. It brings to the individual far more suffering than happiness in a semi-civilized world, which still goes to war, still encourages the production of unwanted children by exhausted mothers, and still compels married partners who hate one another to live together in the name of morality. Out of the desultory and miscellaneous reading in which, under Miss Heath-Jones's inspired and unconventional tuition, I indulged between the ages of 15 and 18, a poem, a novel, and a challenging triumph of propaganda especially determined the direction in which I was moving. During preparation, one wild autumn evening in St. Monica's Gymnasium, when the wind shook the unsubstantial walls and a tiny crescent of moon, glimpsed through a skylight in the roof, scudded in and out of the flying clouds, I first read Shelley's Aeneas, which taught me in the most startling and impressive fashion of my childhood's experience to perceive beauty embodied in literature, and made me finally determined to become the writer that I had dreamed of being ever since I was 7 years old. I still defy anyone, however highbrow, to better the thrill of reading, for the first time, and at 16, the two familiar lines. The one remains, the many change and pass. Heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows fly. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. The novel, strangely enough, was Mrs. Humphrey Ward's deistic tract, Robert Elsmere. Had I realized when I read it that its author was even then portentously engaged in rallying the anti-suffrage forces, it might have influenced me less. But I remained ignorant until some years later of Mrs. Ward's political machinations, and her book converted me from an unquestioning if somewhat indifferent churchgoer into an anxiously interrogative agnostic. To Olive Schreiner's Woman and Labor, that Bible of the woman's movement, which sounded to the world of 1911 as insistent and inspiring as a trumpet call summoning the faithful to a vital crusade, was due my final acceptance of feminism. Miss Heath-Jones lent me the book soon after its publication, and I can still tingle with the excitement of the passage, which reinforced me, brought up as were nearly all middle-class girls of that period, to believe myself predestined to a perpetual, distasteful, but inescapable tutelage in my determination to go to college and at least prepare for a type of life more independent than that of a Buxton young lady. We take all labor for our province. From the judge's seat to the legislator's chair, from the statesman's closet to the merchant's office, from the chemist's laboratory to the astronomer's tower, there is no post or form of toil for which it is not our intention to attempt to fit ourselves. And there is no closed door we do not intend to force open, and there is no fruit in the garden of knowledge it is not our determination to eat. Thus it was in St. Monica's garden, beside a little overgrown pool where the plump goldfish slid idly in and out of the shadows, and the feathered grasses drooped their heavy heads to the water's edge, that I first visualized in rapt childish ecstasy a world in which women would no longer be the second-rate, unimportant creatures that they were now considered, but the equal and respected companions of men. Indeed, that school garden, now trimly beautiful in its 20-year-old mellowness, but then recently hewn from the rough surface of the downs and golden-hedged with tangled gorse and broom, has been for me somehow associated with every past phase of life. There, at the age of 16, I first began to dream how the men and women of my generation, with myself, of course, conspicuous among that galaxy of Leonardos, would inaugurate a new renaissance on a colossal scale and incidentally redeem all the foolish mistakes of our forefathers. There, more realistically, I planned my long-desired and constantly postponed career. There sought refuge after the anxiety of college examinations. There waited for news from the war, and felt the sinister shudder of the guns from the Belgian coast shake the Caterham Valley like a subterranean earthquake. There, too, when the war was over, I wandered about after taking the older girls for classes in history and international relations, thinking about relations quite other than international, and wondering whether or not to get married. But I anticipate. In my last term, as head girl, I did no examinations and very little work, except for special history and literature classes with a visiting mistress, Miss F., one of those rare teachers who, like Miss Heath Jones, possessed originality and a real talent for inspiring ideas. Her gifts may be judged from the fact that she succeeded in filling me with a tremendous enthusiasm for the works of Carlyle and Ruskin. The most important of all terms so far, as it marked the rising of my star, begins an earnest fragment of 16-year-old diary recorded during the holidays after Miss F. first went to Kingswood, though fortunately the reference was not to herself, but to the impetus given by her teaching to the growth of those sentiments which, under the influence of past and present, I should then have described as my ideals. An elegant, introspective, temperamental creature, Miss F. once spent a few days in Buxton with me and my family, who mildly disapproved of her, and told our fortunes on a dull afternoon. Over Edward, who was then 16, she appeared indefinite and uncommunicative. But to me she remarked, "I think you'll be married all right," the phrase implying acceptance, even on her part, of what was still supposed to be the major preoccupation of an intelligent girl. "But if you're not married at 21, you'll have to wait till you're 30. By that time, you'll have some kind of a career. I don't know quite what it will be, but it will turn out well and your marriage won't interfere with it." Just before I left St. Monica's, I played the part of the Madonna in Eager Heart, Miss Buckton's Christmas mystery play, which gave a peculiarly memorable and emotional quality to my last weeks at school. Temperamentally, at least, I was thoroughly well adapted to the role, and this fact, to anyone who knows the play with its half-sentimental, half-mystical detachment from the pedestrian demands of everyday life, will perhaps give a better idea than anything else of the state of mind in which, before I had turned 18, I left school to come out into the alien atmosphere of Buxton society. It would not, I think, be possible for any present-day girl of the same age even to imagine how abysmally ignorant, how romantically idealistic, and how utterly unsophisticated my more sensitive contemporaries and I were at that time. The naiveties of the diary which I began to write consistently soon after leaving school and kept up until more than halfway through the war, must be read in order to be believed. My reflective record 1913 is endorsed on its title page with the following comprehensive aspirations: to extend love, to promote thought, to lighten suffering, to combat indifference, to inspire activity, to know everything of something and something of everything. The same page contains a favorite quotation from Rostan's Princess Lointain. Inertia is the only vice, Master Erasmus, and the only virtue is enthusiasm. One entry, made on the 20th December 1913, after a local dance, runs as follows. It leaves me with a very unsatisfied feeling to have met so many stupid and superficial men with whom all the girls are obviously so pleased. How I wish I could meet a good, strong, splendid man, full of force and enthusiasm, and in earnest about his life. There must be such. I have never shown this expression of my emotional aspirations to my husband, so I do not know whether or not he would regard himself as fulfilling the description. By 1916, the optimistic ideals of earlier years had all disappeared from the title page of my ingenuous journal. They were replaced by a 4-line verse from the writings of Paul Verlaine, which has always seemed to me to represent more precisely than any other poem the heavy sense of having lived so long and been through so much that descended upon the boys and girls of my generation after a year or two of war. Oh, what have you done? You who are here crying incessantly? Tell me, what have you done? You who are here with your youth? William Noel Hodgson, who when only 20 was killed on the Somme, similarly lamented this lost youth, which we had barely known, in one of the saddest little songs that the war produced. It brought me near to weeping, I remember, when after 4 years of hospitals, and last leaves, and farewells, I heard it sung by Topless Green at the Albert Hall about 1919. Take my youth that died today, lay him on a rose-leaf bed, let them hide his tumbled head, roses passionate and red that so swiftly fade away. Let the little grave be set where my eyes shall never see. Raise no stone, make no regret lest my sad heart break. And yet, for my weakness, let there be sprigs of rue and rosemary. But again, I anticipate. The navvy quotations from my youthful diary, which I have used and intend to use, are included in this book in order to give some idea of the effect of the war, with its stark disillusionments, its miseries unmitigated by polite disguise, upon the unsophisticated new who grew up in a purely social sense, just before it broke out. The annihilating future Armageddon, of which the terrors are so often portrayed in vivid language by League of Nations Union prophets, could not possibly, I think, because the bright young people of today, with their imperturbable realism, their casual, intimate knowledge of sexual facts, their familiarity with the accumulated experiences of us, their foredoomed predecessors, 1/10 of the physical and psychological shock that the Great War caused to the modern girl of 1914. It is, of course, conceivable that young women brought up like myself in the provinces were more childishly and idealistically ignorant than their London contemporaries. Yet, looking back upon the London girls with whom I went to school, I do not think that the difference was very great. One of them I well remember saying to me, just after she came out, that she was always afraid of going too far with men because she really didn't know what too far was. I was quite unable to enlighten her, though an incident that had happened to me 2 or 3 years earlier made me certain that the vague peril was something extremely embarrassing and profoundly uncomfortable. At the end of one school term, I had been as usual shepherded by a mistress into the train at St. Pancras for the long journey to Buxton. Carefully observing the rule, which originated in contemporary white slave traffic alarms, that we were never to travel in carriages alone with men, She selected a compartment in which the one male passenger was safely accompanied by a respectable elderly female. Unfortunately, at Kettering, the first stop after we left St. Pancras, the elderly female got out, and immediately the train started again. The strange man, a swarthy, black-haired individual of the commercial traveler class, with rolling eyes and large hairy hands, came over from his corner and sat down beside me. I was waiting for that old cat to get out so that we could have a nice little talk, he promisingly began. More alarmed than I allowed myself to appear, I looked helplessly at the closed door leading to the corridor, but though its very existence protected me better than I realized, it was completely cut off by my companion's insinuating bulk. "I see you're going to Buxton," he continued, looking at my initialed suitcase. "How I wish I hadn't got to get out at Leicester. Now won't you just tell me your name?" Encouraged by the mention of Leicester, which was only another half-hour's journey, I responded inventively that my name was Violet Brown and that I didn't live in Buxton, but was only going there for a week to stay with friends, a fabrication inspired by the nightmarish fear that this apparition might suddenly appear in search of me on our own front doorstep. "And how old are you?" he inquired, pressing closer, and looked disappointed when I answered truthfully that I was 14. "Why," he exclaimed, "you're such a pretty little girl. I thought you must be quite 17. When you get home, you must send me your photograph," and he squeezed me still further into the corner. It was then that I realized that the train, upon which I was depending to convey me to Leicester and salvation, had suddenly come to a standstill. Some shouts were raised along the line. My enemy heard them and informed me with satisfaction that we had broken down and could not possibly get to Leicester for over an hour. "Now what a lucky thing we're together," he said softly, and took my hand, a grubby enough schoolgirl's fist with ink-stained nails chipped by games and amateur gardening. "Pretty little girls like you shouldn't bite their nails," he murmured playfully, examining my fingers. "You'll stop biting them to please me, won't you? And give me a kiss to show that we're pals?" The leering black eyes, the pawing hands, and the alcoholic breath combined with the train's delay to drive me into a panic. Suddenly desperate, and probably more muscular than my tormentor had anticipated, I flung myself with an immense effort out of his encroaching arms and dashed frantically into the corridor. The subdued, middle-aged woman into whose compartment I blindly stumbled, flushed and hatless, regarded me with amazement, but she accepted my incoherent tale of an awful man and pacified my agitation by giving me a share of her luncheon sandwiches. When, after quite an hour's breakdown, we did at last pass Leicester, she went with me to retrieve my suitcase from the compartment in which I still feared to see my swarthy assailant. But he had gone. I never related this incident to my family. The thought of the hullabaloo that would follow, of the fuss that would be made both at home and at school whenever I had to travel alone, filled me with too great a distaste. But so deep was the repugnance aroused in me that I remember it as clearly as though it had happened last week. It was not, however, until the summer of 1922, when from an open-air platform in Hyde Park, I supported the 6-point group in urging the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Bill by the House of Commons, that I realized the existence as legal conceptions of indecent assault and the age of consent. So far as I can now judge, at 18, I was at least as interested in social problems, and in what were then always referred to as the facts of life as most of my contemporaries, though my sexual curiosity was always a bad second to my literary ambition. Yet when the war broke out, I did not clearly understand what was meant by homosexuality, incest, or sodomy, and was puzzled by the shadow that clung to the name of Oscar Wilde, whose plays I discovered in 1913 and read with a rapturous delight in their epigrams. Nearly all the older girls with whom I went to school had been addicted to surreptitious conversations about the advent of babies, periodic discovery by parents or teachers, thrust these intriguing speculations still further underground and led to that intensive searching for obstetrical details through the Bible and such school library novels as David Copperfield and Adam Bede, which appears to have been customary almost everywhere among the adolescents of my generation. Thanks to this composite enlightenment, in addition to the decorous elucidations of household medicine, I had a fairly comprehensive, though somewhat Victorian idea of the primitive fashion in which the offspring of even the most civilized parents make their appearance, but of how to rear infants and train small children I had not the slightest notion either in theory or in practice, since the influence of married women in the education of girls mostly destined for wifehood and maternity was then considered even less desirable than it is today. I was also, despite my stock of physiological information, still extremely hazy with regard to the precise nature of the sexual act. This half-knowledge engendered in me so fierce an antipathy to the idea of physical relationship, insofar as this happened to be separable from romance, that when, soon after I left school, I was proposed to by a neighbor of ours, a large, athletic young man with limited brains and evangelical principles, who strongly disapproved of my unwomanly ambitions, and could not possibly have been attracted by anything more substantial than my childish prettiness. My immediate and only reaction was a sense of intolerable humiliation and disgust. When first I had to nurse a case of venereal disease, which I had hitherto seen referred to in the press only under the mysterious title of the hidden plague, I did not know exactly what it was. I was fully enlightened only in 1917, when in a Malta hospital I watched a syphilitic orderly die in convulsions after an injection of salvarsan. Finally, my pre-war knowledge of army doctors and nurses was derived entirely from the more idealistic poems of Kipling, which by no means helped me to understand the suggestive words and movements, the desperate secret maneuverings of men and women tormented by unnecessary segregation. It should now be clear that, easy victims as I and the boys and girls similarly reared provided, with our naive, uninformed generosities and enthusiasms, for the war propagandist in a non-conscription country, few young women could have been less forewarned and forearmed than I was against war in general and army hospital service in particular. But when I became, in 1912, a provincial debutante, decked out in London, bought garments that I did not know how to wear, the war was still 2 years away, and my hospital service more than 3. That unparalleled age of rich materialism and tranquil comfort, which we who grew up at its close will never see again, appeared to us to have gone on from time immemorial, and to be securely destined to continue forever. At my first dance, the High Peak Hunt Ball, I appeared modestly attired in the conventional white satin and pearls. This ingenuous uniform entitled me to spend the greater part of the next few weeks, gyrating to the strains of dreaming and the vision of Salam in the arms of physically boisterous and conversationally inept young men. Those dances were by no means the mere gay functions that they seemed. They were supposed to test out the marriageable qualities of the young women on the basis of their popularity as dancing partners, and were therefore attended by numerous competitive chaperones who watched the proceedings with every symptom of apprehension and anxiety. Judging from the inferiority complex permanently implanted in one or two of my contemporaries who did not come out of the test with flying colors, I'm inclined to believe that provincial dances are responsible for more misery than any other commonplace experience. 3 years afterwards, as I was clearing my desk before going as a voluntary aid detachment to London, I was quitting Buxton forever. Though I did not then realize it, I came across a ribbon-tied heap of my early dance programs carefully put away in a drawer. By that time, so many of the fatuous young men had acquired dignity through death in France and the Dardanelles, that these records of my dances with them seemed like the incongruous souvenirs of a long-vanished and half-forgotten world, a world in which only the sinking of the Titanic had suddenly, but quite temporarily, reminded its inhabitants of the vanity of human calculations. I put the programs back with the half-sorrowful, half-scornful indulgence that a middle-aged woman might feel when coming upon the relics of some youthful folly. For the rest of 1912 and the first half of 1913, I went to more dances, paid calls, skated and tobogganed, played a good deal of bridge and a great deal of tennis and golf, had music lessons, and acted in amateur theatricals. In fact, I passed my days in all those conventional pursuits with which the leisured young woman of every generation has endeavored to fill the time that she is not qualified to use. Even my persevering attempts to follow, in accordance with St. Monican tradition, the intricacies of Home Rule and Welsh disestablishment through the columns of the Times gradually slackened and ceased for lack of external encouragement. My only concession to the social conscience uncomfortably developed in me at school consisted of reluctant visits to my mother's districts in the village of Burbage, near the lime kilns below the sickle-like curve of Axe Edge. Here I made myself useful by distributing copies of Mothers in Council, the official organ of that curious union which believes the compulsory association of antagonistic partners to be somehow conducive to the sanctity of marriage. My desultory and totally unorganized reading of George Eliot, Thackeray, Mrs. Gaskell, Carlyle, Emerson, and Marriage-Kowski made little impression upon this routine, though their writings offered occasional compensation for its utter futility. The reading of Romola enthusiastically records my diary for April 27, 1913, has left me in a state of exultation. It is wonderful to be able to purchase so much rapture for 2 shillings and 6pence. It makes me wonder when in my life will come the moments of supreme emotion in which all lesser feelings are merged, and which leave one's spirit different forevermore. Throughout those months which witnessed the outbreak of the First Balkan War, the renewal of the Triple Alliance, and a great deal of intermittent agitation over German spies, I never ceased, though often now with a failing heart, since the possibilities had begun to seem so small and the obstacles to be overcome so great, to pester my parents to send me to college. These importunities were invariably received by my father, with the statement that he had already spent quite as much on my education as was necessary, and that little girls must allow their elders to know what was best for them. I found this attitude of good-natured skepticism peculiarly exasperating, since in my own eyes I was not, of course, a little girl at all, but a 20th century evangelist entrusted with the task of leading a benighted universe from darkness to light. The apparent objects of my upbringing being what they were, some of my acquaintances have been surprised that I was never sent to Paris to be finished. That is, to be shaped yet more definitely in the trivial feminine mold which every youthful instinct and ambition prompted me to repudiate. Despairing of Oxford, and defensively smitten with the idea of postponing the dreaded isolation of Buxton, I had even, in my last term at school, misguidedly pleaded for a few months in Paris or Brussels. But my father was almost as much opposed to Paris as to college, on the ground that as soon as I got over there, I should probably be seized with appendicitis. A not unnatural fear on his part, though I had never been threatened with the disease, and up to the present have escaped it. Balked of the minor alleviation, I returned again and again to the major attack. The desire for a more eventful existence and a less restricted horizon had become an obsession, and it never occurred to me to count on marriage as a possible road to freedom. From what I already knew of men, it seemed only too probable that a husband would yet further limit my opportunities, a conclusion fully warranted by the fact that nearly all the men I knew not only lived in Buxton, but regarded it as the most desirable place of residence in England. Each fresh refusal to spend another penny on my education, though the cost of my music lessons, and of the expensive new piano, which was ungrudgingly bought for me to practice on, would have paid for nearly a year at Oxford, plunged me into further depths of gloom. I felt trammeled and trapped. And after a few months at home, I hated Buxton, in spite of the austere beauty of its peaks and dales, and the health-giving air which induced so many rheumatic invalids to live hopefully in its hotels and take its waters, with a detestation that I have never since felt for any set of circumstances. Nearly 200 miles from London, and therefore completely cut off. In days when a conscientious provincial mother would almost as soon have submitted her adolescent daughter to seduction as allow her to spend a few unaccompanied hours in town, or entrust her with the baby Austen type of freedom from the groups of ambitious, intelligent boys and girls who naturally gravitate together in university towns and capital cities. I was wholly at the mercy of local conditions and family standards. I had nothing to do and no one to talk to. Edward for most of the year was at Uppingham, and with Mina and Betty I became more and more out of touch as the months went by. Even at 18, a mentally voracious young woman cannot live entirely upon scenery. Two things alone prevented me, during Edward's school terms, from dying of spontaneous combustion: my diary, which I kept in a voluminous detail that now makes me marvel at the amount of time I must have had on my hands, and the appearance in a neighboring village of a rationalistic curate whose unorthodox dissertations on the higher criticism I took for the profoundest learning, and whose florid, dramatic sermons, to which every Sunday I walked 3 miles to listen, seemed to me the most inspired eloquence. The holidays were more bearable, for Edward's return from Uppingham always brought with it a fresh outburst of music, which lent, if only vicariously, some object to life. I was never more than a second-rate pianist, for my hands were too small to stretch an octave easily. But Edward, already a skilled and passionate violinist, depended upon me to accompany him in the complicated sonatas and concertos that he brought home from school. So at Christmas and Easter and Midsummer, I went round with him to local at-homes, amateur concerts, and musical evenings, plowing strenuously after him through the prestissimos and rallentandos, the arpeggios, tremolos, and accidentals of the Beethoven No. 1 Sonata, the Mendelssohn and Spofer concertos, and the rippling 17th-century melodies of Alessandro Scarlatti and Pietro Nardini. Those 2 pre-war years in Buxton left me deeply imbued with a form of snobbishness, which I do not suppose that I shall ever outgrow, and which is, perhaps, the only one in which I was not deliberately educated. The universal middle-class snobberies of birth and wealth and Anglicanism I soon repudiated, and took a naïve delight in so doing. I even believe that I have set myself free, though only within recent years, from the more insidious snobby of Puritan respectability, which causes women of my class and generation to regard the sexual lives of their husbands as a species of personal property, and to treat with sour disapproval or self-conscious patronage any female acquaintance who happens at any time to have indulged in extramarital relations. But from the snobbery of metropolitanism, the superiority of the Londoner towards the small-town dweller, I do not think I am likely to recover, even though the calm voice of reason, so irritatingly disdainful of our dearest prejudices, tells me that the wireless and the cinema distance motorbus have probably transformed the provinces out of all recognition since 1915. To me, provincialism stood and stands for the sum total of all false values. It is the estimation of people for what they have, or pretend to have, and not for what they are. Artificial classifications, rigid lines of demarcation that bear no relation whatsoever to intrinsic merit, seem to belong to its very essence, while contempt for intelligence, suspicion, and fear of independent thought appear to be necessary passports to provincial popularity. Its mean, censorious spirit is typified for me by the local bank manager's querulous little wife who took my mother, as a young married woman giving her first small dinner party in Macclesfield, severely to task for having mixed her set. In some of the larger provincial cities, a rich and enterprising life does seem possible, which is free from this carping pettiness. I am thinking especially of Manchester, where we often used to go for a day's shopping. The home of such remarkable families as the Pankhursts and the Laskys and the Simons, Manchester seems to have escaped the stigma of provincialism, perhaps on account of the national standing of the Manchester Guardian, which in Buxton we never saw, the household preferring the Manchester edition of the Daily Mail. Perhaps even more, because the hard-working habitués of the city keep the leisured members of their families out of the way in the surrounding suburbs. Social snobbery and unreal values seem to reach their height in towns with between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants. Buxton, which my father used to describe as a little box of social strife lying at the bottom of a basin, must have had a population of about 12,000, apart from the visitors who came to take the waters. I am not, I think, a naturally vindictive person, but in those years when the beautiful heather-covered hills surrounding Buxton represented for me the walls of a prison, I used to swear to Edward that one day I would take my revenge in a novel, and I did. None of my books have had large sales, and the least successful of them all was my second novel, Not Without Honor. But I have never enjoyed any experience more than the process of decanting my hatred into that story of the social life of a small provincial town. Sometimes during Edward's holidays, I used to relate to him incidents destined to appear in this book in much the same way as, during our childhood, I had kept him awake at night with tales of the fabulous Dicks. He was still as good a listener as ever, since the chief interest of his life and the exclusive object of his ambition was, as in earlier years, his violin. It is, and always has been, difficult to estimate what manner of person Edward really was at the close of his Uppingham years, and it becomes harder as time marches on. He came, soon after the war broke out, to mean so much to me, and I to him, that I sometimes wonder whether either of us troubled completely to understand the other apart from our very close mutual relationship. Undoubtedly, he was handsome, in incongruous contrast to my 5'3". He grew to be well over 6 feet in height, and had dark, velvety, rather somber brown eyes, beneath long, thick lashes and almost black arched eyebrows, which gave some substance to my mother's theory that there had been French or Spanish blood in her family a little distance back. At 16, he was inclined to be rather priggish and self-righteous. Not such bad qualities in adolescence, after all, since most of us have to be self-righteous before we can be righteous. By the time that Edward reached 19, he had acquired a charming, easygoing manner, another inheritance, perhaps from our musical grandfather, which won him a good deal of popularity, and was particularly effective in interviews with senior officers and War Office officials. But beneath the agreeable surface, I and others who knew him well continually came up against something adamant and rigid through which we could not penetrate, like a vein of flint in a soft rock, as I described it in my diary in 1914. Mentally, I suppose, he was intelligent rather than intellectual. His taste in literature was limited to plays, short stories, and a few poems, most of which had some practical significance. And though he won a good many prizes as a small schoolboy, he continually missed them as he grew older. At Uppingham, he was invariably second or third in his form. His school reports, apart from those of his music masters, were never brilliant and never unsatisfactory. His one absorbing passion was music, to which he added the persistent determination that our unlucky grandfather had so conspicuously lacked. At 17, he had already begun to compose songs and concertos. As soon as a sheet of music paper was in his hand, he became a different creature, irritable, alert, and absorbed. On instruments other than the violin, the organ, the piano, and the viola, he became a tolerable performer after a very few lessons. How gifted he really was as a violinist, how promising as a composer, I cannot now tell, though it is perhaps significant that both Mr. Sterndale Bennett at Uppingham and Sir Hugh Allen at Oxford were keenly interested in his possibilities. My father's plans for him varied between the successorship to himself at the paper mills, an occupation to which I should have been better adapted than Edward, who had no business ambitions and no interest whatever in commercial processes, and the Indian civil service, for which his form master declared that he would never pass the necessary examinations. In his private dreams, Edward always visualized himself as a famous conductor-composer, a kind of junior Sir Henry Wood. But he had too much discretion to press the claims of his talent upon my father, who regarded music, for a man, as one of life's non-essentials, and always explosively objected to the sounds of violin practicing. Edward's whole nature led him to prefer roundabout methods of persuasion to the challenging directness with which I was wont to stir up parental opposition. "Dear child, so worried," he used to remark with laconic amusement whenever I emerged, breathless and angry, from one of my belligerent encounters with the family. Secretly, he determined to read music as well as greats at Oxford, and to let his future be dictated by the result. He was, I think, inwardly relieved when he failed to win a scholarship for New College in 1914, but passed in easily as a commoner on his papers. He was thus freed from the obligation to work for a high honors degree, which would have interfered considerably with the time available for music. In spite of his limited qualities of scholarship and his fitful interest in all non-musical subjects, the idea of refusing Edward a university education never so much as crossed my father's mind. I loved him too dearly, even while he was still at school, to be jealous of him personally, particularly as he was always my gallant supporter. But I should have been far more patient and docile than I ever showed any symptom of becoming, if I had not resented his privileged position as a boy. The most flattering of my school reports had never, I knew, been regarded more seriously than my inconvenient thirst for knowledge and opportunities. In our family, to adapt a famous present-day phrase, what mattered was not the quality of the work, but the sex of the worker. The constant and to me enraging evidences of this difference of attitude towards Edward and myself violently reinforced the feminist tendencies, which I had first acquired at school, and which were being indirectly but surely developed by the clamorous drama of the suffragette movement far away in London. "It feels sad to be a woman," I wrote in March 1913, the very month in which the Cat and Mouse Act was first introduced for the ingenious torment of the militants. "Men seem to have so much more choice as to what they are intended for." The passage of time, or so, at least I fondly believe, has changed my furious Buxton resentments into mellower and more balanced opinions. But probably no ambitious girl who has lived in a family which regards the subservience of women as part of the natural order of creation ever completely recovers from the bitterness of her early emotions. Perhaps it is just as well. Women have still a long way to travel before their achievements are likely to be assessed, without irrelevant sex considerations entering into bias. The judgment of the critic, and even their recent political successes, are not yet so secure that those who profit by them can afford to dispense with the few acknowledged feminists who are still vigilant and still walk warily along once forbidden paths. Early in 1913, when my hopes of ever escaping from provincial young ladyhood were almost abandoned, came the first unexpected intimations of eventual release. One spring evening, a Staffordshire acquaintance, an old family lawyer, came to spend the night at our house. Judiciously prompted by my mother, who was now beginning, perhaps because my refusal to adapt myself to Buxton had now convinced her, secretly to sympathize with the idea of college, he began at dinner to talk about Oxford, and I learnt that his elder son, who had won a scholarship there, had only just gone down after taking a brilliant degree. My father, not to be outdone in parental self-congratulation, thereupon not only mentioned his determination to send Edward to Oxford, but threw in my own continual requests to go to college to make up the balance. To his surprise, our visitor took this expression of feminine ambition entirely, as a matter of course, and even mentioned one or two of his son's acquaintances among the women students. Like many men who have been brought up without academic contacts, my father was at first more ready to listen to family cronies without any special title to their opinions than to unfamiliar experts with every qualification for offering advice. The fact that his highly respected old friend regarded the presence of women at Oxford as in no way remarkable undoubtedly caused him to revise his opinion on the whole subject of the higher education of daughters. This transformation process was completed by a course of university extension lectures given by Mr. Marriott, now Sir John, in Buxton Town Hall during the spring of 1913. Of recent years, I have sometimes heard criticisms of Sir John Marriott by his political opponents, both at Oxford and elsewhere. These party criticisms usually imply more or less directly that long experience as a university teacher does not adapt a man or woman to political life, and that it was probably owing to his academic qualities that Sir John lost the supposedly safe conservative seats of Oxford and York. In this country, apart from university constituencies, there is certainly a rigid line, difficult to cross, between the political and the academic worlds. A line which in parts of America is becoming indistinct, with advantages to both sides. Judging from my experience as a graduate of one university and the wife of a professor attached to another, it does seem to me that academic life in any country tends to make both men and women narrow, censorious, and self-important. My husband, I believe to be among the exceptions, but one or two of his young Donish contemporaries have been responsible for some of the worst exhibitions of bad manners that I have ever encountered. Apparently, most Dons grow out of this contemptuous brusqueness as the years go by. Elderly professors, though often disapproving, are almost always punctilious. On the whole, I have found American Dons politer than English, and those from provincial universities more courteous than the Oxford and Cambridge variety. To attribute, however, to Sir John Marriott the brusquer characteristics of academic Oxford seems to me to argue precisely that lack of perspicacity that party opponents so often encourage in themselves. I write this without rancor, since I belong myself to that party whose program is anathema to Sir John and his colleagues. Today I can agree with few of his political opinions, but if he believed every clause of the Versailles Treaty to be divinely inspired, I think I should forgive him. So deep still is my thankfulness for his breezy and uncalculating intervention in my obscure affairs. No man could have had less contempt for unfamiliar ways of living, or more interest in the bypaths of experience. On the only occasion that they met, I remember how skillfully he persuaded my father, with whom he can have had next to nothing in common, to discourse with lively enthusiasm on the technique of paper-making, and to relate the modest history of our mill. For me, Sir John remains and always will remain the kindly, stimulating teacher in whose genial presence obstacles, hitherto insuperable, melted away like snow in April. He represents the deus ex machina of my unsophisticated youth, the Olympian who listened without a hint of patronage or amusement to the halting account of a callow girl's vaunting, ingenuous ambitions. To him, I owe my final victory over family opposition, my escape from the alien atmosphere of Buxton and the university education, which for all its omissions did at long last equip me for the kind of life that I wanted to lead. It is a debt that I acknowledge with humble gratitude and can never hope to repay. The most optimistic enthusiast for adult education could hardly have described that Buxton course of extension lectures on the problems of wealth and poverty as a conspicuous success. I stayed away from the first to go to a dance. This far had I already fallen from grace. But I attended and wrote, the sole regular essayist out of the whole town, for all the 5 others. Sir John gave of his vigorous and popular best. But a prophet from heaven could not have impressed his listless and dwindling audience, of which the older and somnolent half had come out of consideration for the feelings of the local secretary, and the younger and fidgety half under compulsion from its parents. It was, I think, at the 4th or 5th lecture that he was moved to tell his yawning listeners that Buxton did not strike him as particularly inquisitive, a remark which led to a good deal of adverse criticism of the lectures at subsequent tea parties. I even heard one voluminous lady, whose husband had launched out upon an essay answering all 3 alternative questions, instead of selecting one as he had been told to do, remark to sympathetic acquaintances that she never had liked the man's manner, and that she had heard he only came to Buxton because they wouldn't have him in Oxford. My own persevering essays on the Industrial Revolution, the problem of distribution, the history of trade unionism, and the rise of the socialist movement must have been crude and superficial in the extreme, since neither the local free library nor the little collection of schoolbooks on my bedroom shelves contained any relevant works on either history or economics, but the reports that they received from Sir John were sufficiently encouraging to be described by my father as a great honor from an Oxford man. No doubt, as indeed I have since discovered when lecturing myself, one wheat ear of enthusiasm was worth a good many tares of indifference. I signed my first tentative effort with initials only, and when I nervously went up to claim it, Sir John showed considerable surprise, as well indeed he might have done, for no one could have looked more immature or less capable of formulating a coherent idea than I did in those days. For all my long skirts and elaborate empire curls, I never succeeded up to the time that the war broke out in appearing older than an unfledged 15. At the request of the local secretary, a cultured woman who was, needless to say, only on the fringe of the set, my family agreed to put Sir John up for his last Buxton lecture. On this occasion, he returned my weekly essay at home, after we came back from the now almost empty town hall. His praise moved me to speak, in my parents' presence, of my longing to go to Oxford, and I asked his advice with regard to the first steps to be taken. The genial matter-of-factness with which he gave it seemed to dispel all doubts, and made the customary objections look so trivial that they were hardly ever mentioned again. The next morning he departed, leaving a singular feeling of emptiness where his stimulating presence, his tweed coat, and his golf clubs had been. I do not suppose that he ever thought again of our household, or realized in the least how completely his flying visit had altered the atmosphere. After Sir John had gone, changes seemed, in comparison with the utter stagnation of the previous year, to happen very quickly. I went in for, and won, an essay competition which he had advised me to attempt in connection with that year's Oxford summer meeting. I also received, and accepted, an invitation to stay at St. Hilda's Hall for the meeting itself with my aunt and Miss Heath Jones. The result of the essay competition further gratified the dawning pride in my modest achievements, which Sir John's encouragement had aroused in my father. Before I went to the summer school, he told me that he had decided to send me to Oxford for a year, and did not seem unduly disconcerted when I returned home with the information, then as much news to me as to him, that if I wanted a degree, I must remain at college not merely for 1 year, but for 3. I went to St. Hilda's in a state of ecstatic entrancement, which I do not now know whether to regard as funny or pathetic or incredible. I only wish that I were still capable of feeling it about anything. Oh, when I think of it all, I had written in my diary with ingenuous rapture after accepting my aunt's invitation, I feel as though I were in a dream from which I am afraid to awaken. Oxford. What doesn't it call up to the mind? The greatest romance of England, the mellowed beauty of time and association, the finest lectures the world can produce, wonderful libraries, and fascinating old bookshops, the society of Miss Heath Jones, the best I could desire on earth, and the meeting all the interesting intellectual people miss. Heath Jones knows. Oh God, have pity on my fierce excitement and grant that it may come to pass and be even better than I dream. When I did arrive at this earthly paradise, I was not, strangely enough, in the least disappointed. Even the lectures, the finest the world can produce, came up to my expectations, a fact which seems to indicate that few of the usual term-time lecturers can have been included in the summer school program. There was a light on my path and a dizzy intoxication in the air. The old buildings in the August sunshine seemed crowned with a golden glory, and I tripped up and down the high street between St. Hilda's and the examination schools on gay feet, as airy as my soaring aspirations. My fellow thirsters were the usual summer meeting collection of unoccupied spinsters, schoolmistresses on holiday, fatherly chapel-goers, and earnest young men in sweaters and soft collars, but I thought them all extremely talented and enormously important. Had anyone told me that less than a decade afterward I should myself be lecturing to similar gatherings, I should blankly have refused to believe him. For if I was in awe of the audiences, the lecturers seemed to me to be at least on a level with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. And perhaps since they included not only Sir John Marriott on the monarchy of France, but Dean Inge, grave, scholarly, and a little alarming on Old Testament eschatology, I had some excuse for thinking that I had strayed by accident into the most exclusive circle of a celestial hierarchy. The fact that Sir John had asked me to dine with him one evening while I was attending the school added the final drop to my cup of excitement. Palpitating with awe and amazement, I presented myself at his house in Northmoor Road, where I met his beautiful wife and elegant, clever daughter, who afterwards became, rather surprisingly, absorbed in the Girls' Diocesan Association. So remarkably had my prospects changed since the spring that we talked of my university future as a foregone conclusion. Sir John, no doubt bearing in mind the sheltered life of a Buxton young lady, took for granted that I should try to enter Lady Margaret Hall, for this has always been the politest of the 4 Oxford women's colleges, and in those days it invariably wore, like my Buxton Academy, school for the daughters of gentlemen's heir, strictly Anglican gentlemen, of course. Trembling but determined, in spite of the gratitude and admiration, which almost unnerved me, I contradicted his assumption. I had already talked over the 4 colleges with a business associate of my father's, Mr. Horace Hart, then controller of the Oxford University Press, who told me that Somerville was undenominational, and that it had become, owing to its high examination standards, by far the most difficult of the women's colleges to enter. From the University Press windows, Mr. Hart and I had looked across Walton Street at the terracotta walls of Somerville drowsing in the afternoon sun. I had found irresistibly fascinating both its closed garden and the idea of its arrogant intellectual impregnability. But perhaps what chiefly attracted me, still theologically dominated by Robert Ellesmere and the rationalistic Buxton curate, was its religious toleration. So I told Sir John that it was not the socially safe head of Lady Margaret Hall whom I had arranged to see, but the scholarly and intimidating principal of Somerville. My appointment with her was fixed for 8 o'clock one evening after dinner. I felt indescribably elated, yet definitely insecure about the legs, when I found myself for the first time within the walled garden, and saw the wide lawn and the heavy drooping elms and sycamores in the fast vanishing light. I came upon the principal, who is just like a tiger cat, I noted afterwards in my diary, before I expected to see her, sitting over her after-dinner coffee with the history tutor on the narrow stretch of grass outside the senior common room. As I followed the scout across the garden, the principal got up to greet me. Her immensely tall, angular figure seemed to go on unfolding for several minutes before my apprehensive eyes, and the vast gulf of lawn between us made me even more conscious than usual of my insignificant stature. Being quite ignorant of the plain Jane and no-nonsense conventions of Oxford women dons, I had carefully changed, in accordance with the sartorial habits of Buxton, into evening dress, and was wearing a flimsy lace frock under a pale blue and gray reversible satin cloak and an unsubstantial little pair of high-heeled white Swede shoes. So unlike the customary felt hat and mackintosh of the average 1913 woman, student was this provincially modish attire, that the principal actually referred to it when she interviewed me during the scholarship examinations in the following March. "I remember you," she said immediately. "You're the girl who came across the lawn in a blue evening cloak." But on this first occasion, my frivolous appearance, combined with my complete lack of examination certificates and my deplorable ignorance of even the Greek alphabet, obviously convinced her that I was a singularly unpromising candidate. Nevertheless, she patiently described to my appalled ears the barbed wire fence of examinations that had to be scaled before an ambitious but totally unqualified young woman could hope to enter Somerville, and, incredible as it must have appeared to her that I did not know it, endeavored to make me understand the difference between university responsions and the college entrance examination. In conclusion, she advised me to take English, then, as now, the woman's subject at Oxford, to exempt myself from responsions, since I knew no Greek, by means of the Oxford Senior Local, and on no account to try for a scholarship. Finally, she left me at the gate with a sheaf of printed regulations in my hands and returned to her companion, probably calculating with some satisfaction that she was never likely to see me again. For the greater part of an anguished night, I sat up in my little room at St. Hilda's and puzzled over those documents. My aunt and Miss Heath Jones had already departed. The maiden ladies in whose charge I had been left were, I knew, even more ignorant than myself about women's colleges, while I was only too well aware that no one either at home or in Buxton would regard those lists of bewildering alternatives with any sentiment more helpful than mystified impatience. More than once, I dissolved into angry tears of baffled despair. No one familiar with examination rules has any idea what Arabic and Sanskrit they can appear to an anxious, unsophisticated young candidate whose very chance of success may depend upon her correct interpretation of their complex intricacies. As it was, I never grasped from the Somerville data the fact that if I wanted a degree in some distant and improbable future when degrees for women were attained, the Oxford Senior would not exempt me from responsions Greek, and that I would still have to take the subject after I went up. So instead of tackling the easy rudiments of Greek grammar, I set myself the unnecessarily difficult task of reaching a high standard in mathematics, always a weak point, and in Latin, with which I had the merest nodding acquaintance, since it was not included in the regular curriculum at St. Monica's before 1914. When at last I went to bed with the dawn, sleep was effectually banished by a return of the black despair that had so often overwhelmed me in Buxton. Why, I wonder, do people who at one time or another have all been young themselves, and who ought therefore to know better, generalize so suavely and so mendaciously about the golden hours of youth, that period of life when every sorrow seems permanent and every setback insuperable? During that miserable night, I fully believed that I had overcome the psychological objections to the life that I so much desired, only to be frustrated by inexperience and academic shortcomings. My slowly relenting father, I felt, must not be asked to finance 2 sets of coaching for 2 separate examinations. And even if he could be persuaded to do so, who was there in Buxton capable of preparing me for college entrance papers? These difficulties, and my weakness in Latin and mathematics, meant that it was the dreary Oxford Senior for which I must be coached. Somehow or other, I should have to do my best with the Somerville English unaided, although I had no books, no notion of the standard that I ought to reach, no knowledge, since public and high school girls were quite outside the range of my experience, of the probable attainments of my competitors, and no one, for I feared to trouble the magnificent Sir John any further, to whom to turn for advice. Apprehensively, I quailed at the prospect of simultaneously preparing, in the bridge and dance-dominated atmosphere of Buxton, for 2 examinations: the Somerville entrance to be taken in March, and the Oxford Senior in the following July. Not until I returned to Buxton and encountered the cheerful equanimity of Edward, home for the holidays, did I finally resolve not only to take my chance of success despite unfavorable appearances, but to adopt an even bolder policy than I really thought feasible. "Why not take the Somerville school?" demanded Edward, as we were practicing tennis strokes against a brick wall in our circumscribed backyard one afternoon. "Why stick at the entrance? You've got far more brains than most girls." "How do I know I have?" I inquired with some reason. "Oh, I'm sure you have. Most of the chap's sisters are such idiots. Besides, old Marriott wouldn't have made all that up about your essays. I'd try for the school if I were you. I would really. You won't get one, of course. But you'll have a much better chance of getting in than if you take the potty entrance papers." So at length I decided, in the teeth of the principal's sagacious advice, to shoulder the additional burden of the scholarship examination, partly to spite her obvious and pardonable assumption that I was a complete fool, partly in order to keep Edward's respect, which I valued, and partly because, in those days, the difficult thing had a will-o'-the-wisp fascination, luring me, in spite of a great deal of natural timidity, down unfamiliar and alarming roads of experience. I had been rash enough to select the college with the highest standard of scholarship. I might as well be a little more foolish, and attempt to enter it by the most resistant of doors. The next few months were an uphill grind enough, but I thoroughly enjoyed them. No longer did my conscience prick me because I omitted to read about gun running in Ulster, or to study those tentative treaties in the 2 inflammable Balkans, which so nearly coincided with that curiously ironic ceremony, the opening of the Palace of Peace at The Hague. Even the suffragette movement, in which I was so deeply interested, became, for the time being, a mere faraway fable of window smashings and bomb explosions and damaged pictures in public galleries. To have some real work to do after more than a year of purposeless pottering was like a bracing visit to a cliff-bound coast after lethargic existence on a marshy lowland. The mornings I gave to the scholarship examination, getting up every day at 6 o'clock, and working steadily till lunchtime in a chilly little northwest room, known as the sewing room at the back of the house. It was on the ground floor and dark as well as cold, but I was not allowed a fire out of consideration for the maids, though we then kept 3 and a garden boy. But I gladly endured my frozen hands and feet in order to obtain the privacy and quiet which none of the living rooms in ordinary use would have given me. Books were as usual a problem. The free library appeared to stock nothing that had been published since 1880, and the local circulating libraries, justified by the exclusive demands of their customers, supplied little else but fiction. So I spent the greater part of that autumn's tiny dress allowance on the necessary volumes of Fielding and Goldsmith, Wordsworth, and the Cambridge History of English Literature. Friends and relatives helped at Christmas with haphazard volumes of criticism, chosen entirely at random, but with the best of intentions, on the Lakeland poets and the Romantic Revival. After luncheon, the energetic twitching of my athletic limbs drove me, fortunately for my health, out of doors to an afternoon's golf or tennis. From this I returned to tussle, often lacrimoniously, with mathematics and Latin for the rest of the day. At first, the complications of finding tuition for these 2 nightmare subjects had appeared almost insuperable. Help was naturally not to be expected from establishments founded for the creation, out of very raw material, of matrimonially eligible young ladies. The lackadaisical and self-conscious young masters from the local boys' preparatory schools were approached in vain. My rationalistic curate might have proved adequate, but his days were already overcrowded, and the numerous remaining clerics understood the social gradations of Anglican unctuousness better than the scientific pitfalls of mathematics. I had already begun to contemplate a tedious journey 2 or 3 times weekly into Manchester, which would greatly have interfered with my work for the scholarship, when the problem was solved by a neighbor of ours who ran a small institution for pushing backward boys by force into Sandhurst or Woolwich. Financially, this coaching school was always on the rocks. It did not, in fact, survive my need of it by many weeks, and any apprehensions which its owner may have felt about the occasional presence of a young female among his feather-brained students was swallowed up in his relief at the prospect of some unexpected fees. The ages of the youths in his charge varied from 17 to about 23, as the whole dozen had between them barely enough intelligence to fill the head of a normal 6th form schoolboy. It can well be imagined that the coaching obtainable there was not of a very remarkable order. The owner of the school, a social acquaintance of ours, took me himself for mathematics. He was patient and benevolent, but not very resourceful in coaching devices, and could only repeat helplessly, "Oh yes, you do, you know?" in response to my frequent and quite honest asseverations that I did not understand almost all the algebraical propositions that he put before me. For him, his rowdy pupils had some rudiments of respect, which was not, however, accorded to his elderly classical assistant, who wore a beard, spoke with a lisp, and owned a singularly infelicitous cognomen, which cannot have helped him to manage the ruthless young adolescents who came under his charge. The tedious hours which I spent in listening to this unattractive individual's elucidations of the Aeneid appeared to the young gentleman to be humorous in the extreme. A sudden enthusiasm for the reference books on the shelves of my classroom was apt to seize them as soon as my coachings began, and one after another would come in at intervals to borrow a dictionary or return an encyclopedia. Strange phenomena invariably followed these periodic visitations. Piles of books would fall with a crash to the floor, pieces of furniture would mysteriously collapse, and on one occasion a gramophone concealed behind the window curtain burst forth zestfully into "Stop Yer Ticklin' Jock." After each of these poltergeist disturbances, my teacher would look suspiciously round like a puzzled old dog, but it never seemed to occur to him to connect them with the boys.